So I posted a video just before God of War came out stating that all the hype surrounding the game had convinced me to go against my better judgment and pre-order the game. Since then I've played a fair bit, I got the Platinum Trophy, and I'm currently doing no damage runs on the hardest difficulty for some challenging fun. I think with all that I'm in a pretty good position to share my views on whether all the hype was valid and whether or not you should buy God of War yourself and get into the game. Now, if you haven't already bought the game, then you can rest easy with this video, as I'll make sure it is completely spoiler free. The footage running in the background as I talk will be trailer footage only. Okay, first let's address the elephant in the room, and by that I mean all the hype surrounding the game. When I decided to pre-order the game, was getting 10 out of 10 from just about everywhere I looked. Notable gamers like SkillUp were calling it the game of the generation. In my should I pre-order video, I listed a ton of quotes from major game reviewers that pretty much made God of War seem like the best thing since the invention of the wheel. Even now the front page of Metacritic results has numerous users scoring it 10 out of 10 after 10 out of 10. But is it a 10 out of 10? Is God of War really as good as all the perfect scores so many people are giving it? To answer that, you need to have an idea as to what you personally want to get out of the game. If pure combat is your thing, then no, you probably aren't going to find yourself rating God of War 10 out of 10. Now don't get me wrong, the combat in God of War is really fantastic. Maybe it's even a 10 out of 10 in and of itself. But the game is not just a combat game. There's a lot of combat, to be sure, but apart from encountering new enemies in new areas, there's not a lot of enemy replayability. Once you beat a boss, for example, you've beaten that boss and you can't just go back and fight that boss again without starting a whole new game. Or maybe you could if you loaded a save file where you save the game prior to fighting the boss and you fight the boss again as if you never had. God of War isn't like Nioh, for example, where you can spend hours just loading into a boss fight, or any fight for that matter, if all you want to do is fight and fight and fight and hone your skills against a particular type of enemy. In God of War, once you've won, you move on and that's pretty much it. But the combat that is in the game is superb. Slick would be a nice way to put it. I do absolutely love it, to be honest. The mechanics aren't as deep as a game like Nioh, which I think has set the bar in terms of having the deepest combat system of any melee combat based game, but God of War still has a fair depth to it. There are plenty of skills and abilities to learn as you go, and in fact as you go, more combat abilities open up to you that take the game from what seems perhaps a little combat shallow in the early hours to something seriously special later on. I can't say more about that without ruining it, so I'll leave that comment there, but what I will say is the combat has a certain feel to it that I think is unsurpassed by any game, Nioh included. It gives you the ability to time your moves the way you want, from blocking to attacking to countering and so forth, in a way that feels so on point that I really can see how it is that so many people would happily give the combat 10 out of 10. But I wouldn't, and I'll tell you why. I've already said how fantastic the combat is, how it feels great, and how you can time your moves, and how there are a lot of moves to learn. But combat is a synthesis of many other elements too, including your weapon runes, armor enchantments, and different armor set perks, that all add up to give your character different moves and abilities. The problem is, by the time you've unlocked all of these options, the game is pretty much over, and you never really get to fully explore them. Plus, the game isn't driven by combat alone, so even as you progress, combat is interspersed with things like puzzles, climbing, walking, listening to stories, rowing a boat, and so on. Let's just say, even though combat is great, you do have to wait for it. But the single viewpoint, the single camera, without any cutscene narrative kind of way that it plays out, makes you forget about that, so I'm not really going to criticize combat for being interspersed with other things. What I'm saying is, if you think God of War is just a combat game, you'll probably be disappointed, at least until you realize the rest of the game around the combat is worth it anyway. And the rest of the game is phenomenal, with fantastic combat forming a part of it. If you think of a great game being like a jigsaw puzzle, then God of War's combat is just one piece of that overall puzzle, where just about every piece of the puzzle is as top-notch as every other piece. Things like really awesome boss fights, engaging characters, a creative and magical setting, and epic moments that take your breath away, and later in the game, combat that really isn't rivaled by any other game, if you ask me. Man, it's really hard not to say some of the stuff that blew my mind and give it all away, but if I do, I'll definitely spoil the game for you, and if anything is true about God of War, it's the fact that it is an experience worth playing blind, or at least as unaware of what unfolds as you can be. Seriously, don't look up guides on how to play, don't watch spoilery reviews, don't do any of that stuff. Even avoid my channel since I'm posting tons of different videos on the game at the moment. Just shut down YouTube, really. What I'm saying here is if your goal is to play a phenomenal game from start to finish and be happy with the experience of doing just that, then you're probably going to be extremely happy with God of War, and you'll be even happier if you do so without spoilers. A loose analogy might be like saying God of War is something like a 30 to 40 hour interactive movie where you'll find yourself walking out of the cinema and screaming at anyone who'll listen that you just saw the best movie of your life. All that said, if the desire for a long and deep and rewarding and ongoing interactive movie is your thing, then God of War probably isn't going to do that for you. The game does have some end game elements, but they are sparse, and by the time you really start to get into them, with all your new shiny armor upgrades and whatnot, they dry up. If the game had a New Game Plus mode where you could take everything you earn throughout your journey and all your upgrades into a brand new purposefully designed end game, it would be a 10 out of 10 through and through without question. But I'm sorry to say, as much as I want that, and I know a lot of other people and probably you will too, it really just isn't there. Will it be there one day? I don't know the answer to that. There's been pretty much no confirmation of DLCs or endgame plans as far as I'm aware. If anything, there have been confirmations that there will be none of it. For now, it would be best to assume that what you get with God of War out of the box is what you're going to get to play with and nothing more except for patches, which in Santa Monica Studios' favor, there's been a lot of those. So they're really on the ball with updating the game and fixing any issues, of which there are very few. Of course, while all of that is definitely detracting, well, not really detracting as much as disappointing, since the game is so great, I'm pretty sure everyone who plays it would want an NG Plus mode. This isn't without reason. God of War is a technical feat in so many ways, from its phenomenal graphics and movement and feel to the crazy good 5.1 surround sound, superb voice acting, Bear McCreary's epic Black Sailors music, and so on. But in particular, its single-cut camera viewpoint that follows your camera from your character from the very start to the very end without a cutscene. These technical feats are nothing short of mind-blowing, and the fact that they're produced into a game that lasts anywhere from 30 to 40 or even 50 hours if you really take your time mean that things like NG pluses and an extensive end game were basically sacrificed for the time it took to make the rest of the game so damn fluid and immersive. I mean, we have to give Santa Monica Studio a break here and realize it took 5 years to make this game what it is. It would have taken a lot longer to add an in-depth end game too. We can want it, sure, but had we got it, then something else probably would have had to give. The point here is this: if you're expecting a 10 out of 10 game in God of War, you need your expectations to be managed with the knowledge that the totality of what is a brilliant game is more or less confined to your one and only playthrough. Yes, earlier I mentioned I'm playing through the hardest difficulty setting for no damage runs, so I guess you could argue once you've played through on a lower difficulty setting, a technical end game might be to do it all again on, say, the Give Me God of War difficulty setting, which is the hardest setting. I personally don't consider harder settings any kind of endgame though, but it does provide something extra, I guess. However, be warned that this isn't a setting for the average gamer. The Give Me God of War difficulty is quite difficult at times and will test even the best players out there. More to the point, it's really only there for players who want a big challenge. To be honest, the way the difficulty setting works in the God of War, or Give Me God of War difficulty setting, kind of feels a bit tacked on to me, rather than purposefully designed with challenge in mind. But it is challenging, so if a big challenge isn't your thing, then you probably should steer clear of playing the game on that setting. I certainly don't recommend starting the game on that setting unless you are the type of person who is happy playing encounters over and over again until you master how to get through them. But even then, the extreme difficulty of some of those can wreck the immersive nature of the ongoing narrative of the game, which is core to the game, especially in your first playthrough. So I would still recommend, even if you're a good player, choosing an easier difficulty to start with. Now, most people will start the game on its balance mode, which is the one I recommend. This is a mode designed to meld the difficulty of combat with the story in a way that isn't too hard and isn't too easy either, allowing a good amount of immersion into the ongoing narrative as well as good and enjoyable combat. But this brings me to the story. I'm not going to spoil the story for you, though it would be kind of difficult to do that since when you really look at it, the actual story, or rather the end goal of your gameplay that drives the story, is pretty one-dimensional. I've seen respected reviewers giving the story 10 out of 10, and while I really can't say the story itself comes close to a 10 out of 10, I can also see how such a rating can be justified, so I might just explain that now. The main driving goal of the characters is pretty flimsy, and it's not really done in a way that makes you care at all about it, if you ask me. At least that's true to begin with. But as the characters grow along the way of trying to achieve the end goal of the story, it becomes their story that is the true essence of the unfolding narrative, propped up by tidbits of land lore that you gather as you go, which are also very cool. Early in the game, I actually gave this a 5 out of 10 for the story, as I wasn't that impressed, but as the game progressed, I definitely became more invested in all the characters of the game, which I guess helped the story resonate with me a little bit more. And while character development and lore can only ever be elements of a story, and while the story itself isn't a 10 out of 10, I will say the investment you get in it as a result of playing through the single viewpoint is very, very high. The one camera viewpoint with no cuts. It's really high. I can't help but wonder if the story would be rated low by most reviewers, if not for the investment you get in it thanks to the "you're really in it" feeling created by the one-shot, no cutscene approach. I really think it would be rated low if not for that. But here's the thing, I generally don't play games for a story, it's the gameplay that matters to me. A good story supports good gameplay, that's true, but I feel story is placed far too many times on a pedestal in gaming when it really shouldn't be. If a game has great gameplay, I couldn't care less about a so-so story. And while the story may be a bit one-dimensional of God of War, when you really analyse it, God of War definitely has great gameplay. And with the one-shot view driving your ongoing immersion, whatever shortfall we might want to say the story has, it still kind of feels more real than pretty much any other game I've ever played. I almost feel like I'm missing something in saying that, but I'm really not. The fact is, the story isn't mind-blowing, but it is extremely engaging once you play for a few hours. That's why I can see the justification in people giving it a 10 out of 10. I wouldn't if I was rating the pure story, but I would if I was rating the immersion in it. So, okay, what would I rate God of War overall? I'd give the graphics of the game a 10 out of 10. You can see that in the footage yourself. I'd give the music a 10 out of 10 as well. Bear McCreary is pretty much phenomenal in everything he composes, and God of War is no different. The sound in this game is phenomenal, also 10 out of 10. The voice acting is as good as any from absolutely every actor involved, also 10 out of 10. In fact, without spoiling anything, let me just say I felt like the main antagonist in the game was one of the best I've experienced in any game. I really loved the antagonist in God of War, and I can't really say anything more about that without spoiling it. Length of gameplay is definitely good. At 30 to 40 hours or so, you can stretch it to 50 if you really dawdle. The gameplay itself is also great, moving to superb midway through the game. You'll definitely want more of it by the end, that's for sure. I did, and that's why I started playing the hardest difficulty mode, to get more of it. I should also mention the directing. Since the game is a one-shot view with no cutscenes, this may be the very first game that I've ever played where the actual directing of each moment was noticeable and impressive. I don't think I've ever mentioned the directing immediately upon completing any game before, at least that I can remember, so yes, the directing gets a 10 out of 10 as well. Honestly, as I rattle off all these things, I really want to give God of War a 10 out of 10. I do think people like SkillUp, who have called it the game of the generation, are pretty well right. But for me, I felt like the game lacked a little design foresight in its approach to handling the end game. This would be less of a criticism from me if the design of the game itself had handed out all the armor sets and enchantments and runic perks and whatnot earlier, so you could have had fun playing a good chunk of the last half of the game with them. But some of the gear I would love to have used, I literally got by defeating the last of the endgame enemies who don't respawn, making the rewards pretty much of no value at all. And no, you can't take your stuff into an NG Plus as there isn't one. I kind of feel like the design of the game might have intended there to be an NG Plus, but if not, then the rate at which you can acquire resources and craft gear and get rewards was a little too slow for my liking. I would take a slight mark off the 10 out of 10 for that. Also, I mentioned earlier that the Give Me God of War difficulty mode feels a little tacked on rather than purposefully designed mode. It's difficult to comment too much on why without giving away spoilers, but let me just say some of the battles in this mode force you at times to engage from afar instead of in close, mainly causing you to throw your axe over and over instead of allowing you to get in close with your melee combat, which after the 1000th axe throw starts to become monotonous and boring. I love a good challenge, and maybe my view on this is dampened a bit by the fact that I've been trying to do it all without taking any damage, but my preference would have been more enemy complexity rather than just enemy power and health buffs, which is the way the mode feels right now. But though I still like the mode, I think it falls a little short of what it could have been, and so a slight mark is lost there from my perspective. And finally, I also would take a slight mark off for the one thing I consider to be the biggest no-no in video games, and that is taking the kill shot away from you during boss battles. I've never liked battling a boss for 10 minutes only to have the final blow take place as a pre-rendered animation, effectively robbing you of that final killing blow moment. This pretty much happens with every major boss in the game, and it's something I've hated since the very first time I encountered it in any game. When I fight a boss, the killing blow must be owned by me. That's where the satisfaction of beating the boss comes from, that final blow that says, I did it. But when that moment never comes and instead your controls are ripped from your hands by a final blow animation, well, the satisfaction never comes for me. At least it doesn't to the same degree that it should. So for that, throughout the game, I can't give it a 10 out of 10, though I will say that at least in God of War, when it does that, it does so with pretty cool animations. My problem here in rating God of War is it's such a good game overall in so many respects that while I feel it isn't quite a 10 out of 10, I feel it's so close as to not be a 9 out of 10 either. For this reason, I think a better rating would be out of 100. I see the overall Metascore on Metacritic as 94 with a 9.2 average user score. I think those numbers are pretty accurate and fair, to be honest. Me, I'd go as high as maybe 97 out of 100, for I feel despite the areas in which I think it could have been better, when graded on an overall basis for how the game feels to play and the level of joy you get from it as an entertainment product, I think it's closer to 100 out of 100 than not. Oh yeah, I should also add credit to Santa Monica Studios for the fact that the game contains no microtransactions, no underhanded loot boxes, and doesn't ask you to fork out for DLC so that you can play the rest of the game at another future date. God of War, and again thanks to Santa Monica Studios, is a shining example of how a great single-player game can be when released in its entirety right out of the box. With that also considered, maybe a 98 or a 99 out of 100 is fair. Whatever, the real point here is if you haven't already bought God of War, you should. Here in Australia, games are $100 to buy new, and so you really have to think twice before forking over your hard-earned cash. But with God of War, you don't. I honestly feel it was worth every cent of it. And now that I've said all that, it's back to the game for me.